The flight begins. The sun was just beginning to rise over the Manhattan skyline as Malcolm Everett made his way through the bustling terminal of JFK Airport. Dressed in jeans, sneakers, and a navy hoodie, Malcolm looked like any other passenger preparing for a cross-country flight to Los Angeles. However, he was far from ordinary. A seasoned FBI agent with years of undercover experience, Malcolm had mastered the art of blending in. Today, his assignment was to attend a high-profile briefing in LA. But for now, he was just another traveler navigating the chaos of the airport. Malcolm was a man of discipline. His steel-gray eyes scanned the terminal as he moved, always aware of his surroundings. Old habits from years in the field. He wasn't looking for trouble, but he knew trouble had a way of finding him. After passing through security and grabbing a coffee, Malcolm boarded the plane, settling into his seat near the back. It was a full flight, with families, business travelers, and tourists occupying every row. A routine journey, or so he thought. As passengers filed in, Malcolm noticed a woman in first class causing a commotion. She was hard to miss. Her platinum blonde hair was immaculately styled, and her designer clothes screamed wealth and privilege. She wore oversized sunglasses indoors and a permanent scowl on her heavily made-up face. Malcolm guessed she was in her mid-40s, but her demeanor aged her beyond her years. The flight attendants were already bending over backward to cater to her demands, but nothing seemed to satisfy her. "I asked for sparkling water, not this tap water garbage," she hissed at a flight attendant, waving a glass in the air. "What kind of airline is this?" The attendant's polite smile faltered, but she apologized profusely and scurried away to fetch the sparkling water. Malcolm shook his head subtly. He'd seen her type before. Entitled, loud, and always seeking control in every situation. He made a mental note to keep his distance. As the plane took off, Malcolm popped in his headphones, letting the music drown out the hum of the engines and the occasional cries of a restless baby a few rows ahead. He opened a book and settled into what he hoped would be a quiet, uneventful flight. But peace was fleeting. About an hour into the flight, the woman in first class, whom Malcolm had mentally nicknamed Karen, began her next tirade. She was standing now, her voice carrying through the cabin. "This seat is unacceptable," she announced loudly. "I specifically asked for more legroom. This is not what I paid for." Passengers exchanged uncomfortable glances. One of the flight attendants, the same one who had dealt with her earlier, approached cautiously. "Ma'am, I assure you this is the seat you reserved," the attendant explained, her tone measured but firm. "If you'd like, I can provide an extra pillow or blanket for your comfort." Karen scoffed. "A pillow? Do I look like I need a pillow? I need a better seat. And I need it now." Her complaints continued for several minutes, growing louder and more theatrical. Malcolm stayed glued to his book, determined to avoid becoming involved in the drama. But then Karen's attention shifted. Her sharp eyes scanned the cabin, landing on Malcolm. She frowned, her expression shifting from irritation to something more hostile. He noticed her gaze but chose to ignore it, hoping she would lose interest. She didn't. "Excuse me," she barked, her voice cutting through the air like a whip. "You there?" "Yes, you." Malcolm looked up slowly, his calm demeanor betraying none of the annoyance he felt. "Yes, Mom." "You need to sit down," she said, pointing a manicured finger in his direction. "You're blocking the aisle." Malcolm glanced around, confused. He wasn't in the aisle at all, just stretching near his seat. "I'm not in the aisle, Mom," he replied politely. "I'll sit down in a moment." Her face twisted into a sneer. "Don't mind me," she snapped. "I've been watching you since you got on this plane. Acting like you own the place." Malcolm's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "I'm not sure what you mean, but I assure you I'm just here to fly like everyone else." "Oh, don't play innocent with me," she said, her voice rising. "People like you always think you can get away with anything." The phrase "people like you" hung in the air, heavy with implication. A few passengers gasped quietly. Others turned away, pretending not to hear. Malcolm could feel the tension building, but he forced himself to remain calm. He had encountered plenty of bigots in his time, and he knew how to handle them. "Ma'am," he began, his tone firm but composed, "I think you're mistaken. I'm not here to cause trouble. Let's leave it at that." Karen's laugh was sharp and cold. "Oh, I'm not mistaken. You're one of those freeloaders, aren't you? Probably didn't even pay for your ticket. People like you are ruining this country." Malcolm clenched his fists under the tray table, his knuckles whitening. The other passengers were visibly uncomfortable now. A young mother shielded her child's ears. A man across the aisle shook his head in disbelief. Karen's voice continued to rise, her words dripping with venom. "You probably don't even belong in this country. If it were up to me, people like you wouldn't be allowed on a plane like this." The flight attendants were frozen, unsure of how to intervene. Malcolm could see the fear and indecision in their eyes. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay composed. He knew reacting in anger would only escalate the situation. But the words stung. They always did. "Lady, you need to stop," came a voice from a few rows behind. A tall man with a deep voice and a no-nonsense demeanor had stood up. His gaze bore into Karen with quiet authority. "You're embarrassing yourself." Karen turned to him, her face red with fury. "Who you think you are?" she snapped. "I'm the victim here. This man is making me uncomfortable, and I have every right to speak up." The man crossed his arms. "No, you don't. You're the only one making people uncomfortable. Sit down and leave him alone." A ripple of agreement passed through the cabin. Other passengers nodded or murmured their support, emboldened by the man's intervention. Karen's face flushed with humiliation, but her anger didn't dissipate. Instead, she muttered under her breath and returned to her seat, glaring daggers at Malcolm as she sat down. The tension in the cabin didn't ease entirely, but for the moment, the storm had passed. Malcolm let out a slow breath, grateful for the stranger's support. Still, he knew this wasn't over. People like Karen never backed down for long. The unveiling of intent. The cabin settled into an uneasy quiet after Karen's initial outburst, but the tension still hung thick in the air. Malcolm kept his gaze fixed on the book in his lap, though the words blurred together. He could feel the weight of her glare from across the aisle, a palpable reminder that she wasn't done with him yet. The flight attendants resumed their duties, moving cautiously through the cabin as if stepping on thin ice. They glanced at Malcolm and Karen occasionally, their expressions strained with a mix of sympathy and helplessness. No one wanted to reignite the fire, but everyone knew it still smoldered. Malcolm shifted slightly in his seat, his training as an FBI agent urging him to assess the situation carefully. Karen wasn't just an angry passenger. She was someone who thrived on control, and losing the crowd's favor had clearly rattled her. People like her didn't walk away. They regrouped, recalibrated, and came back stronger. He had dealt with worse, but this felt different. It wasn't just about him anymore. The entire flight was on edge because of her venomous behavior. About 30 minutes passed before Karen made her next move. She stood abruptly, the sudden motion drawing the attention of nearby passengers. She didn't stop this time, though. She moved with a calculated deliberation toward the flight attendants gathered near the galley. Malcolm watched from the corner of his eye, noting the change in her demeanor. She was no longer shouting or flailing. Instead, she leaned in close to the lead attendant, her voice low but intense. Whatever she was saying, it was making the young woman visibly uncomfortable. The attendant nodded stiffly, her eyes darting toward Malcolm, then away as Karen continued speaking. Malcolm's instincts kicked into high gear. He adjusted his posture, ready to intervene if necessary, but he remained seated for now. This was a public flight, not an interrogation room. He couldn't act unless she escalated further. The conversation at the front of the cabin ended with Karen giving a triumphant huff and returning to her seat. The lead attendant hesitated, then walked down the aisle, stopping at Malcolm's row. She crouched slightly, lowering her voice. "Sir, I apologize for the disturbance earlier," she began, her tone hesitant but professional. "We're doing our best to ensure everyone has a comfortable flight." Malcolm nodded, his expression neutral. "I appreciate that. Is there something I should know?" The attendant hesitated, glancing over her shoulder toward Karen, who was watching the interaction with a smug expression. "The passenger in 3A has expressed concerns," the attendant continued carefully. "She's requested to have you removed from the flight upon landing." Malcolm raised an eyebrow, his calm demeanor belying the frustration simmering beneath the surface. "And what reason did she give for that?" The attendant's face flushed slightly. "She claimed you've been behaving in a way that makes her and others uncomfortable. We understand this isn't true, but protocol requires us to document any passenger complaints." Malcolm sighed. "I understand you're just doing your job, but I haven't done anything to warrant such a claim. If this continues, I'll need to escalate it myself." The attendant nodded quickly. "Of course, sir. Please let us know if there's anything we can do." As she walked away, Malcolm leaned back in his seat, his mind racing. Karen wasn't just a loud, entitled passenger. She was actively trying to weaponize the system against him. He had seen it before, people using their privilege to manipulate authority figures, hoping to turn baseless claims into real consequences. The passengers around him were whispering again, and Malcolm caught snippets of their conversations. "Can you believe her nerve? She's out of line. That poor guy's just sitting there. Someone should do something." But no one moved. No one spoke up directly to Karen. Malcolm understood why. Confronting someone like her required a level of courage many people didn't feel equipped to muster. Still, the silence stung. He was used to being the one stepping in to protect others. But now, when the roles were reversed, the bystander effect was in full swing. The breaking point. An hour passed, and the tension seemed to ease slightly. Karen remained in her seat, though her lips moved constantly, muttering to herself or to the unfortunate man seated next to her. Malcolm tried to focus on his book, but his mind kept returning to the briefing waiting for him in Los Angeles. He needed to be sharp and focused, not drained from a stressful flight. Just as he began to think the worst was over, Karen struck again. This time, she didn't bother with subtlety. She stood abruptly, holding her phone aloft as if it were a weapon. "I demand answers," she shouted, her voice cutting through the hum of the cabin. "I've tried to handle this politely, but enough is enough. I don't feel safe with that man on this plane." Gasps rippled through the cabin, and the passengers turned to look at Malcolm. Some looked at Karen with disdain, while others seemed caught in the confusion of the moment. The lead flight attendant approached quickly, her expression a mix of exhaustion and resolve. "Ma'am, please lower your voice and return to your seat. You're causing a disruption." Karen glared at her. "Oh, I'm the disruption. What about him?" She pointed a shaking finger at Malcolm. "What's he even doing here? He doesn't belong. He's probably dangerous." Malcolm stood this time, moving slowly and deliberately. The passengers around him shifted nervously, unsure of what he would do. "Ma'am," Malcolm said, his voice calm but carrying an edge that silenced the cabin. "I've done nothing to you or anyone else on this plane. Your accusations are baseless, and your behavior is unacceptable." Karen's face twisted in rage. "Don't talk to me like that. I have every right to question your presence here. Who even are you?" Malcolm's lips pressed into a thin line. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather wallet. Flipping it open, he revealed his FBI badge and identification. "I'm Agent Malcolm Everett," he said, his voice steady. "FBI. I'm on an assignment, and I suggest you sit down and think very carefully about your next words." The revelation sent a shockwave through the cabin. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, her bravado crumbling in an instant. The passengers who had remained silent before now erupted into murmurs, some even clapping or cheering quietly. The lead flight attendant looked at Malcolm with a mixture of surprise and relief. "Agent Everett, I apologize for any inconvenience. We'll ensure this situation is handled appropriately." Karen, however, wasn't ready to give up. "I don't care who he says he is. That doesn't mean." The tall man from earlier stood again, cutting her off. "Lady, give it a rest. You've embarrassed yourself enough. Sit down and let the rest of us enjoy the flight." The cabin filled with quiet applause as Karen, her face a deep shade of red, finally sank back into her seat. For the first time since the plane had taken off, Malcolm felt a small sense of vindication. But he knew this wasn't over. Not yet. The moment the plane landed, there would be more to deal with. Still, for now, he allowed himself a small victory. He returned to his seat, slipping his badge back into his pocket as the murmurs of the passengers slowly subsided. It was just another day in his line of work, but he couldn't help but feel the weight of what had happened. This wasn't just about him. It was about standing up to people like Karen, who used hate and fear to try to control the world around them. And today, at least, she hadn't won. Consequences in the air. The plane settled into an uneasy calm after Malcolm's revelation. His FBI badge had turned the tide of public opinion firmly against Karen, but it hadn't completely extinguished the tension. The passengers whispered among themselves, casting furtive glances in Malcolm's direction. Some seemed embarrassed by their earlier hesitation to intervene. Others appeared relieved that someone with authority had finally taken control of the situation. Karen, however, was far from subdued. Though she had retreated to her seat, her face burned with humiliation and anger. Her muttering had stopped, but her fidgeting betrayed her restless mind. She was clearly plotting her next move. Malcolm had dealt with enough confrontations to recognize the signs. People like her didn't just give up. They regrouped and doubled down. Malcolm, for his part, remained stoic. Years of FBI training had taught him the importance of maintaining composure, especially in volatile situations. He knew Karen wasn't finished. She had the demeanor of someone who saw herself as the perpetual victim, even when she was the one inflicting harm. The lead flight attendant approached Malcolm cautiously, her expression a mixture of gratitude and concern. "Agent Everett," she began, her voice hushed. "Thank you for your patience. I've spoken to the captain, and we're documenting everything that's happened. If she continues, we'll have no choice but to request security meet us when we land." Malcolm nodded. "I appreciate that. If she escalates again, let me know. I'd prefer to avoid further conflict, but I'll do what I need to." The attendant gave a relieved smile and returned to the front of the cabin, leaving Malcolm to his thoughts. Karen's next move. Malcolm kept his focus on the view outside the window, watching the endless expanse of clouds stretch across the horizon. But his heightened awareness picked up on Karen's every movement. She was no longer muttering. Instead, she had pulled out her phone and was typing furiously. Her fingers flew across the screen with the kind of intensity that could only mean one thing. She was gathering reinforcements. "Excuse me." Karen's voice rang out again, louder than before. The cabin collectively tensed, heads swiveling toward her. The lead flight attendant approached, her face tight with exhaustion. "Yes, Mom." Karen turned her phone toward the attendant, displaying something on the screen. "I've recorded everything. This man," she jabbed a finger in Malcolm's direction, "has been harassing me, and I've contacted the airline's customer service. I demand that you take action immediately." The flight attendant's eyes flicked to Malcolm, who met her gaze with calm assurance. "Ma'am," the attendant said carefully, "we've been monitoring the situation. Agent Everett has done nothing wrong, and your behavior has been disruptive to the entire flight." Karen's face turned crimson. "Disruptive? Me? I'm the one being harassed. You'll all see when this video goes viral. Everyone will know how poorly I was treated." Malcolm sighed inwardly. She wasn't just trying to create a scene. She was attempting to weaponize public perception against him. It was a tactic he had encountered before, especially in high-stakes cases involving influential people, The difference here was that Karen's audience wasn't the usual courtroom or media outlet. It was an airplane full of weary travelers who wanted nothing more than to reach their destination in peace. The turning point. Before the flight attendant could respond, a passenger seated directly behind Karen stood up. She was a middle-aged woman with a no-nonsense expression and the air of someone who had reached her limit. "Ma'am," the woman said, her voice firm, "we've all been sitting here watching this unfold. You're not the victim here, and no one's going to believe whatever twisted story you're trying to spin." Karen turned, her eyes narrowing. "Excuse me, you don't know anything about what's happening." "Oh, I know enough," the woman shot back. "I've been watching you harass this man since we boarded. You've insulted him, accused him of things you have no evidence for, and now you're trying to play the victim because you've been called out." Karen spluttered, her mouth opening and closing as if searching for a retort. The other passengers murmured their agreement, some nodding or even clapping quietly. The tide had fully turned against her now. Malcolm remained silent, letting the other passengers speak. He appreciated their support, but he knew better than to let his guard down. Karen's type rarely backed down without a final act of defiance. Sure enough, she stood abruptly, her voice rising in a shrill crescendo. "I don't have to listen to this. You're all against me, but you'll see. You'll all see." The lead flight attendant approached again, this time with the captain in tow. The captain, a tall man with a calm but authoritative presence, addressed Karen directly. "Ma'am, this behavior is unacceptable," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You're disturbing the peace and endangering the safety of this flight. If you don't sit down and remain quiet for the rest of the journey, we will be forced to divert and have you removed from the plane by authorities." Karen froze, her face a mask of indignation and disbelief. "You're threatening me. I'm the one being harassed." The captain didn't waver. "This is your final warning. Sit down and comply, or face the consequences." The power of the collective. Karen's bravado crumbled as the weight of the situation finally sank in. She glanced around the cabin, searching for an ally, but found none. Every face was either turned away in disapproval or glaring at her with open disdain. Even the man seated beside her, who had remained silent through most of the ordeal, shifted uncomfortably and refused to meet her gaze. For the first time, Karen seemed genuinely uncertain. She muttered something under her breath and sat down heavily, crossing her arms and glaring at the seat in front of her. The cabin let out a collective exhale, the tension easing slightly. The captain turned to Malcolm, nodding respectfully. "Thank you for your patience, Agent Everett. We'll ensure this situation is documented properly." Malcolm nodded in return. "I appreciate that, Captain." The captain and flight attendant returned to the front of the cabin, and the plane finally settled into an uneasy calm. Malcolm leaned back in his seat, his mind racing despite the apparent resolution. Karen's behavior had been extreme, but it wasn't uncommon. He had seen it in different forms throughout his career. People weaponizing privilege, playing the victim to shift blame, or using public perception as a shield for their own wrongdoing. But this time, something had shifted. The passengers had spoken up. They had refused to let her narrative take hold, and that gave him a glimmer of hope. People were tired of enabling this kind of behavior, and they were beginning to stand together against it. The calm before landing. The rest of the flight passed in relative silence. Karen remained in her seat, fuming quietly, but making no further outbursts. The passengers around her avoided engaging with her, while others whispered about the incident in hushed tones. Malcolm allowed himself to relax slightly, knowing that the end of the flight was in sight. As the plane began its descent into Los Angeles, the lead flight attendant returned to Malcolm's row. "Agent Everett," she said softly, "we've contacted airport security. They'll be waiting at the gate to escort her off the plane." Malcolm nodded. "Thank you. I'll stay behind to give a statement if needed." The attendant smiled faintly. "We appreciate your understanding. And thank you for staying calm through all of this." Malcolm offered a small smile in return. Just doing my job. As the plane touched down and taxied to the gate, Malcolm prepared himself for the next phase of the ordeal. Karen might have been quiet for the remainder of the flight, but he knew her fight wasn't over. She would try to spin the story in her favor, and he needed to be ready. But for now, he took solace in the fact that the passengers and crew had united against her antics. The wheels hit the tarmac, and a ripple of relief passed through the cabin. The ordeal wasn't over, but for the first time, Malcolm felt the tide turning firmly in his favor. The unmasking at the gate. As the plane taxied to its gate at Los Angeles International Airport, Malcolm felt a strange mixture of relief and anticipation. The chaos in the air had finally subsided, but the real confrontation was yet to come. Karen, who had spent the remainder of the flight glaring at anyone who dared look her way, was sitting stiffly in her seat, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. Whatever indignation she had left, Malcolm knew she would unleash it the moment the plane doors opened. Passengers around him exchanged nervous glances, their collective unease lingering despite the relative quiet. Some muttered softly to one another, speculating on what would happen when Karen stepped off the plane. Others avoided eye contact altogether, focusing intently on gathering their belongings or scrolling through their phones. Malcolm remained calm, outwardly unaffected by the tension. Internally, however, his instincts were on high alert. Years of fieldwork had taught him to expect the unexpected, and Karen's erratic behavior was a textbook example of volatility waiting to explode. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their arrival. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Los Angeles. We'll be deplaning shortly, but we ask that everyone remain seated until instructed to disembark. Thank you for your cooperation." The plane rolled to a stop, and the usual shuffle of passengers preparing to leave began, though slower and more subdued than usual. The lead flight attendant, who had handled much of the drama in the air, approached Malcolm's row once more. Her expression was resolute. "Agent Everett," she said quietly, "security is waiting just outside the gate. They'll escort the disruptive passenger off the plane first. Once that's handled, the rest of the passengers will be allowed to deplane." Malcolm nodded. "Understood. I'll cooperate however I can." The attendant hesitated for a moment, then added, "Thank you again for keeping your composure. It hasn't gone unnoticed." Malcolm gave her a small, reassuring smile. "Just doing my part." The walk of shame. The moment the plane doors opened, two uniformed airport security officers stepped aboard. They were met with a wave of nervous whispers and curious stares from the passengers. Karen, however, was unperturbed. She sat up straighter, her lips curling into a smug smile, as if she believed the officers were there to validate her grievances. One of the officers, a tall man with a calm yet authoritative presence, addressed the cabin. "Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We're here to escort a passenger from the plane. Please remain seated and allow us to do our job." Karen stood abruptly, her voice loud and self-assured. "Finally, I've been waiting for someone to take this situation seriously. You're here to deal with him, aren't you?" She pointed directly at Malcolm, her fingers shaking with indignation. The officer's neutral expression didn't falter. "Ma'am, we're here to speak with you. Please gather your belongings and come with us." The color drained from Karen's face, replaced almost immediately by a deep flush of anger. "What? Me? This is absurd. I've done nothing wrong. You're clearly mistaken." "Ma'am," the officer repeated, his tone firmer this time, "please comply. You're being removed from the flight due to your disruptive behavior." Karen sputtered, her eyes darting around the cabin as if searching for an ally. "This is a joke. This man," she jabbed her finger at Malcolm again, "it is the real problem. He's been harassing me the entire flight, and now you're treating me like a criminal." Malcolm remained seated, his expression calm and unreadable. He knew better than to engage. Karen's theatrics were doing more damage to her credibility than he ever could. The second officer, a shorter woman with a steely gaze, stepped forward. "Ma'am, this is not up for debate. Either you come with us willingly, or we'll have to escort you off by force." The murmurs among the passengers grew louder, and a few even pulled out their phones to record the unfolding drama. Karen's outrage boiled over. "This is discrimination," she shrieked. "You're all against me. I'll sue this airline, and I'll sue you." She turned to Malcolm, her voice dripping with venom. "And you haven't seen the last of me." The officers exchanged a look, then moved to either side of Karen. "Ma'am," the taller officer said firmly, "this is your final warning." Realizing she had no choice, Karen grabbed her designer handbag and stormed down the aisle, her heels clicking furiously against the floor. The passengers watched in stunned silence as she was led off the plane, her indignant muttering fading as she disappeared through the door. Debriefing at the gate. Once Karen was gone, the tension in the cabin lifted like a heavy fog dissipating. Passengers began to murmur more openly, some expressing relief, others shaking their heads in disbelief. The lead flight attendant addressed the cabin. "Thank you all for your patience. We'll begin deplaning shortly. Please remain seated until your row is called." As passengers started to gather their belongings, a young woman seated 2 rows ahead of Malcolm turned to him. "Thank you for handling that so calmly," she said, her voice tinged with admiration. "I can't imagine how hard that must have been." Malcolm offered a polite smile. "I appreciate that. It's part of the job." The woman nodded, then added, "Well, you've got a whole plane of people rooting for you now." Malcolm chuckled softly. Good to know. When it was finally his turn to leave the plane, Malcolm was met by the same 2 security officers waiting at the gate. Karen was nowhere in sight, presumably taken to a holding area for further questioning. The taller officer extended a hand. "Agent Everett, I'm Officer Jacobs. Thanks for keeping things under control in there. The captain filled us in on what happened." Malcolm shook his hand firmly. "Just doing what I could to de-escalate." Jacobs nodded. "She's claiming she was the victim, of course. We've already collected statements from the crew and a few passengers who volunteered to speak up. It's pretty clear who was in the wrong." The shorter officer, who introduced herself as Officer Lopes, added, "If you're willing, we'd like a statement from you as well. It'll help us wrap this up quickly." "Of course," Malcolm agreed. He followed them to a nearby seating area, where they conducted a brief but thorough interview. Malcolm recounted the events of the flight with precision, omitting nothing. By the time the statement was complete, Jacobs and Lopes looked satisfied. "Thanks, Agent Everett," Lopes said. "We've got everything we need. She'll likely face a fine and a ban from the airline. If anything more comes up, we'll reach out." Malcolm nodded. "Appreciate it. Good luck with her." Jacobs chuckled. "Thanks. We'll need it." Moving forward. As Malcolm left the gate and headed toward baggage claim, he couldn't help but reflect on the events of the day. Karen's behavior was a stark reminder of the biases and entitlement he had encountered throughout his life and career. But it was also a testament to the power of collective action. The passengers who had spoken up, the crew who had taken a stand, together, they had diffused a situation that could have escalated even further. By the time Malcolm reached his destination, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. His job wasn't just about solving crimes or chasing bad guys. It was about standing against injustice in all its forms. Today had been a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. As he stepped out into the warm California sun, Malcolm allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. There was still work to be done. There always was. But for now, he could move forward knowing he had made a difference. A storm reignited. The warm California sun did little to ease the tension in Malcolm's mind as he stepped out of the terminal. The confrontation with Karen was over, at least on the plane, but he knew the ripple effects might continue. He had faced people like her before, those who refused to let a situation rest, spinning narratives to suit their agendas. Malcolm hailed a rideshare to take him to the downtown FBI field office, where his assignment briefing awaited. As he settled into the back seat, his phone buzzed incessantly. A string of texts and notifications from his colleagues lit up the screen. He opened one message from his supervisor, Director Harper. Harper, Malcolm, heard about the incident. Need a debrief as soon as you arrive. Media's already picking it up. Malcolm frowned, scrolling further. True to Harper's words, links to social media posts and news articles filled the group chat. Karen, it seemed, had wasted no time spinning her story. Videos she had recorded mid-flight were making the rounds online, heavily edited to frame herself as the victim. The headlines were predictably sensational. Woman claims FBI agent threatened her on flight. Passenger removed after confrontation with government official. Malcolm closed his eyes, pinching the bridge of his nose. This wasn't new. He had dealt with media storms before, often involving high-profile cases, but this was different. This wasn't about a criminal investigation or a bureau operation. It was personal. Karen's antics weren't just about her racism. They were an attack on his integrity. The rideshare driver glanced at Malcolm through the rearview mirror. "Rough day?" he asked, his tone friendly. Malcolm offered a small smile. "You could say that." The driver chuckled knowingly. "Well, whatever it is, you look like the kind of guy who can handle it." Malcolm nodded, grateful for the casual reassurance. Little did the driver know how much Malcolm was already juggling. He watched the cityscape pass by, mentally preparing for the conversations that awaited him at the office. The FBI's response. When Malcolm arrived at the field office, he was greeted by a flurry of activity. Colleagues bustled about, phones rang incessantly, and the tension in the air was palpable. Harper met him near the entrance, her sharp features set in a grim expression. "Malcolm," she said briskly, motioning for him to follow her into a conference room. "Let's talk." Inside, a small group of agents and public relations specialists were already gathered around a table littered with documents, laptops, and coffee cups. Harper closed the door behind them and gestured for Malcolm to sit. "We've got a problem," Harper began without preamble. "Karen Marshall, turns out that's her name, has gone viral. She's posted videos claiming you intimidated her and used your badge to silence her. Mainstream media hasn't picked it up yet, but it's only a matter of time." One of the PR specialists, a young woman named Lydia, chimed in. "We're tracking the spread. Most of the comments are calling her out, but there's a vocal minority supporting her claims. You know how these things go. People will believe whatever fits their narrative." Malcolm leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening. "What's the Bureau's stance on this?" Harper crossed her arms. "We stand by you, of course. The airline's crew and passengers have already corroborated your version of events. But this isn't just about facts. It's about public perception. We need to get ahead of this before it snowballs." Malcolm nodded slowly. "What's the plan?" Lydia slid a tablet across the table, displaying a draft statement. "We're releasing an official statement from the Bureau, emphasizing your professionalism and the steps taken to handle the situation. The airline is also preparing a statement to back us up." Harper added, "We'll need you to film a brief interview for internal use, outlining what happened from your perspective. If the media comes knocking, we want to be ready." Malcolm exhaled sharply. "Understood. Let's get it done." The ripple effect. Over the next few hours, Malcolm recounted the events of the flight in meticulous detail. The Bureau's media team recorded his statement, framing it as a factual, professional account of the incident. Meanwhile, Karen's videos continued to gain traction online, sparking heated debates in comment sections and forums. Support for Malcolm poured in from those who recognized Karen's manipulative tactics for what they were. Passengers from the flight also began to share their own videos and statements, exposing the truth of Karen's behavior. Clips showing Karen's outbursts, her racism, and her eventual removal from the plane quickly overshadowed her narrative. Despite the growing support, Malcolm couldn't ignore the darker side of the online discourse. The vocal minority latched onto Karen's claims, accusing him of abusing his power and calling for an investigation. Conspiracy theories sprouted like weeds, each one more absurd than the last. By the end of the day, Malcolm felt drained but resolute. The Bureau had his back, the truth was coming to light, and Karen's credibility was rapidly unraveling. Still, he knew this wasn't over. A final encounter. As Malcolm prepared to leave the office for the evening, Harper approached him with a knowing look. "Before you go, there's something you should see." She handed him a tablet displaying a video that had just been uploaded. It was Karen, seated in what appeared to be a hotel room, her face pale and drawn. The confident, entitled air she had carried on the flight was gone, replaced by a fragile veneer of defiance. "I want to address the lies being spread about me," Karen began, her voice trembling. "I was the victim on that flight. The FBI agent, Malcolm Everett, used his badge to intimidate me, and the airline staff sided with him because of who he is. This is systemic discrimination, and I won't stand for it." Malcolm raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. Harper smirked. Desperation. She's grasping at straws now. The video was riddled with inconsistencies and outright falsehoods, but Malcolm could see the damage it might cause. Karen's framing was inflammatory enough to rally her remaining supporters, creating more noise around an already volatile situation. Harper patted his shoulder. "Don't worry. We've got this under control. Her story is falling apart, and the public's on your side. Just hold steady." The long game. As Malcolm finally left the field office, he reflected on the day's events. The confrontation with Karen had turned into something much bigger than a single flight. It was a battle over truth and accountability, amplified by the relentless scrutiny of the digital age. He knew the coming weeks would be challenging. Karen would likely continue her campaign, and the internet's attention span would fuel the drama. But Malcolm also knew he wasn't alone. The passengers who had supported him, the airline staff who had stood up to Karen, and his colleagues at the Bureau, they all represented a collective resilience against injustice. For now, Malcolm allowed himself a moment of quiet resolve. He had faced worse storms and come out stronger. This was no different. As he drove away from the office, the city lights stretching out before him, Malcolm felt a renewed sense of purpose. His fight wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about standing firm in the face of adversity, no matter how loud or persistent the voices against him might be. The reckoning. A week had passed since the infamous flight, but Malcolm Everett's life had not returned to normal. The incident had taken on a life of its own, becoming a lightning rod for debates about racism, entitlement, and authority in the modern world. News outlets picked up the story, dissecting it from every angle, while social media platforms churned out a seemingly endless stream of opinions, hashtags, and commentary. Malcolm had spent much of the week navigating interviews, meetings with the FBI's legal and public relations teams, and a surprising flood of support from strangers online. He remained steadfast, refusing to let Karen's antics derail his work or sense of self. But even he couldn't deny the toll it was taking. Every time his phone buzzed, it brought a reminder of the chaos. A new headline, a message from a colleague, or another video of Karen doubling down on her version of events. Karen's escalation. Karen, meanwhile, had not gone quietly into the night. Instead, she launched a full-scale media blitz, granting interviews to sympathetic outlets and posting tearful videos on her personal accounts. In each appearance, she painted herself as the victim of a corrupt system that favored authority figures like Malcolm. "The FBI is protecting him because he's one of their own," she declared in one particularly dramatic segment. "But I won't be silenced. This is about justice, not just for me, but for anyone who's been intimidated by people in power." Karen's narrative was riddled with inconsistencies, and her credibility was rapidly eroding. Videos recorded by other passengers on the flight had surfaced, showing her racist tirades and erratic behavior. Public opinion began to shift decisively against her. Still, her core group of supporters clung to her every word, amplifying her accusations and fanning the flames of controversy. Malcolm's moment. On the morning of his long-anticipated assignment briefing, Malcolm received a call from Director Harper. She wasted no time. "Malcolm, we've got an opportunity to put this to bed once and for all," she said. "Are you free this afternoon for a press conference?" Malcolm hesitated. He had avoided public appearances outside of controlled interviews with bureau-approved outlets, wary of pouring fuel on the fire. But Harper's tone suggested this was important. "What's the plan?" he asked. "We're releasing the airline's official report," Harper explained. "It includes statements from the flight attendants, the passengers, and even the captain. It's airtight. The airline's CEO has agreed to speak alongside you, publicly supporting our stance. If you're willing, this is your chance to take control of the narrative." Malcolm exhaled deeply, weighing his options. He had never been one to seek the spotlight, but the past week had shown him the power of truth and the necessity of speaking it loudly when others tried to drown it out. "I'll do it," he said finally. "Let's end this." The press conference. The room was packed. Reporters from major networks and independent outlets crowded together, cameras flashing as Malcolm stepped onto the stage. To his left stood Director Harper, the airline's CEO, and a representative from the Flight Attendants Union. To his right, a podium awaited, flanked by microphones. Malcolm adjusted his tie, a rare departure from his usual casual attire. He wanted to project professionalism and strength. As he approached the podium, the room quieted, the tension palpable. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice steady. "Thank you all for being here." He paused, letting his gaze sweep over the room. "Last week, during a routine flight, I was targeted by an individual whose actions have since sparked widespread attention. I want to make it clear, this was not an isolated incident. It was a reflection of the biases and entitlement that many people face every day." The cameras clicked furiously, reporters scribbling notes as he continued. "I've dedicated my career to upholding justice, protecting the vulnerable, and ensuring that the rule of law is applied fairly. On that flight, I did what I always do. I remained calm, de-escalated the situation, and cooperated fully with the airline staff. The events that followed were beyond my control, but I'm here today to set the record straight." He gestured toward the CEO, who stepped forward to speak. The airline representative outlined the findings of their internal investigation, confirming Malcolm's account and condemning Karen's behavior as disruptive and unacceptable. Video clips played on screens behind them, showing Karen's outbursts and the supportive testimonies of other passengers. When Malcolm returned to the podium, his tone shifted, becoming more personal. "This is bigger than me," he said. "It's about the values we hold as a society. Do we stand up to prejudice, or do we let it fester? Do we let individuals manipulate systems to harm others, or do we demand accountability?" The room erupted into applause, the audience moved by his words. For the first time in days, Malcolm felt a sense of closure. Karen's collapse. Karen's response to the press conference was predictably dramatic, but it lacked the fervor of her earlier efforts. The overwhelming evidence against her had stripped her of much of her support, and her once loyal followers began to distance themselves. The final blow came when Karen's former employer, a luxury real estate firm, announced they were severing ties with her. "We do not condone the behavior exhibited by Ms. Marshall," the statement read. "Her actions do not reflect our company's values." Karen attempted to rally one last time, posting a video decrying cancel culture and vowing to fight back. But the damage was done. Her name became synonymous with entitlement and public meltdowns, and her story faded into the background as the news cycle moved on. Moving forward, for Malcolm, the end of the ordeal brought both relief and reflection. He returned to his work with renewed focus, knowing he had come through the fire stronger. The support he had received, from passengers, colleagues, and even strangers, had reminded him of the resilience of community in the face of adversity. One evening, as he prepared to leave the field office, Harper stopped him in the hallway. "You handled that well, Malcolm," she said. "Better than most would have." Malcolm shrugged. "It's what the job requires." Harper smiled. It's more than that. You stood up for something bigger. Not everyone has the courage to do that. As Malcolm walked out into the fading light, he allowed himself a small smile. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had reinforced what he already knew. The fight for justice was never truly over. It was a series of battles, big and small, fought every day by those willing to stand up and speak out. And Malcolm was ready for the next one.